China is testing Taiwan without starting a war. For years, the world has been waiting for one moment, the day China invades Taiwan. Military planners have spent decades preparing for it. Governments have built strategies around it. Every time tensions rise in the Taiwan Strait, the same question dominates headlines. Is this the beginning? But what if we're watching for the wrong signal? What if the biggest change in the Taiwan Strait doesn't begin with missiles or amphibious landings, but with events so ordinary that most people barely notice them? Another military exercise, another Coast Guard patrol, another group of aircraft crossing the median line. Each incident lasts only a few days, the headlines disappear, life goes on. Yet taken together, they may tell a very different story, because history doesn't always change in a single dramatic moment. Sometimes it changes so gradually that people only recognize it when they look back years later. And that brings us to Taiwan, one island, 23 million people, yet a place that has become one of the most strategically important pieces of territory on Earth. To understand why, we first need to answer a simple question: why does Taiwan matter so much? At first glance, Taiwan doesn't seem like the kind of place that could reshape global politics. It's a relatively small island lying just off China's southeastern coast, separated from the mainland by the Taiwan Strait. But geography has a habit of turning small places into strategic prizes. Taiwan sits at the center of what military planners call the First Island Chain, a natural arc stretching from Japan through Okinawa, Taiwan, and the Philippines before reaching Southeast Asia. To most people, it's just a line of islands on a map. To naval strategists, it's something entirely different. Control over this region influences access to the Western Pacific, one of the world's busiest maritime corridors. Commercial shipping, energy supplies, naval deployments, and military logistics all pass through nearby waters. In other words, what happens around Taiwan doesn't stay around Taiwan. Its effects can ripple across the global economy. But Taiwan's importance isn't just about geography, it's also about technology. The island is home to some of the world's most advanced semiconductor manufacturers. These tiny chips power almost every part of modern life, from smartphones and electric vehicles to artificial intelligence, medical equipment, satellites, and advanced weapons systems. For much of the 20th century, countries worried about securing access to oil. Today, many governments are just as concerned about securing access to advanced semiconductors. A disruption in Taiwan wouldn't simply affect one region. It could interrupt global supply chains, slow manufacturing, and send shockwaves through financial markets around the world. But even that doesn't fully explain why Taiwan sits at the center of one of the most dangerous geopolitical rivalries of the 21st century. To understand that, we have to look beyond economics. For Beijing, Taiwan is not viewed as a foreign country. The Chinese government has consistently maintained that the island is part of China and that reunification remains a long term national objective. Chinese leaders have repeatedly stated that they prefer peaceful reunification, while also saying they have not ruled out the use of force under certain circumstances. Taiwan has followed a very different path. Over the past several decades, it has developed its own democratic political system, armed forces, independent judiciary, and globally connected economy. Most people living on the island have spent their entire lives under that system. For them, Taiwan is not simply a territory, it's home. The United States adds another layer of complexity. For decades, Washington has maintained a policy known as strategic ambiguity. It does not officially recognize Taiwan as an independent state, yet it maintains close unofficial ties with Taipei and continues to provide defensive military support under the Taiwan Relations Act. Exactly how the United States would respond to a future crisis remains deliberately unclear. That uncertainty is part of the strategy. It is intended to discourage Beijing from using force while also discouraging Taiwan from making unilateral changes to the status quo. Whether that balance can hold is one of the defining geopolitical questions of our time, because Taiwan is no longer just a regional issue. It is where military strategy, global trade, cutting edge technology, diplomacy, and the national identity all collide. A decision made in Beijing can move financial markets in New York. A military exercise near Taiwan can prompt meetings in Tokyo, Canberra, and Washington. Very few places on Earth carry that kind of weight. Which brings us back to the question everyone keeps asking. If Taiwan is so important, if Beijing has made reunification a national priority, and if the world's major powers all understand what's at stake, why hasn't China invaded? Because that question assumes military conquest is the only path to changing the balance of power. And that's where the story becomes much more interesting. Why invasion isn't the only option. For decades, discussions about Taiwan have been dominated by a single image: thousands of Chinese troops crossing the Taiwan Strait, amphibious ships approaching Taiwan's coastline, missiles striking military bases, the beginning of a war that could draw in the United States and reshape the global balance of power. It's scenario military planners spent countless hours preparing for. But there's a problem. An invasion of Taiwan would almost certainly be one of the most difficult military operations attempted since the Second World War. The Taiwan Strait is far more than a stretch of open water. At its narrowest point, it's roughly 130 kilometers wide, far enough to expose ships and aircraft for hours before they ever reach Taiwan's coastline. That gives defenders time to detect, track, and prepare. And reaching the island would only be the beginning. Landing troops is one thing, keeping them supplied is something else entirely. Every soldier needs ammunition, food, fuel, medical support, replacement equipment. Those supplies would have to cross the strait continuously while under the constant threat of attack. Military historians often point out that logistics, not firepower, is what decides whether an invasion succeeds or fails. History offers plenty of examples. The Allied landings in Normandy in 1944 succeeded only after years of planning, overwhelming naval and air superiority, and one of the largest logistical operations ever assembled. Even then, the outcome was never guaranteed. Taiwan presents a different but equally daunting set of challenges. Its western coastline offers relatively few beaches suitable for a large amphibious assault. Many of those areas are heavily defended. Beyond them lie dense urban areas, rivers, mountains, and infrastructure that would make any advance slow, costly, and unpredictable. Even a successful landing would not guarantee a successful occupation. But geography is only part of the equation. The economic consequences of a conflict over Taiwan would likely be unlike anything the modern world has experienced. Taiwan sits at the center of global semiconductor production. A major war could disrupt supply chains for everything from smartphones and automobiles to artificial intelligence systems and advanced defense technologies. At the same time, shipping through one of the world's busiest maritime regions could be severely affected. The consequences wouldn't stop in Asia. Factories in Europe, technology companies in North America, manufacturers in Japan and South Korea, virtually every major economy would feel the impact. And then there's the greatest uncertainty of all, the United States. For decades, Washington has deliberately refused to say exactly how it would respond to a conflict over Taiwan. That uncertainty is not a flaw in policy, it's the policy itself. Strategic ambiguity is designed to make military calculations far more difficult. Any decision to use force must account not only for Taiwan's defenses, but also for the possibility of American involvement and potentially the involvement of regional partners such as Japan or Australia. No one knows exactly how such a crisis would unfold, and that's precisely the point. For any military planner, uncertainty increases risk. When the costs are enormous, when the military challenges are immense, when the economic consequences could affect the entire world, and when the international response cannot be predicted with confidence, one obvious question emerges. Why choose the most dangerous option first? Because in geopolitics, there are often many ways to change the balance of power. Some involve armies, others involve patience, pressure, persistence, and strategies that unfold so gradually they're almost invisible. Which brings us to one of the most important concepts in modern geopolitics. The space between peace and war is no longer clearly defined. The war that doesn't look like war. Most people imagine conflict as a dramatic event. Missiles launched across a strait, aircraft striking military bases, amphibious ships approaching a coastline. A clear moment when everyone agrees that a war has begun. But modern competition often looks very different. Instead of trying to win a war outright, the objective can be to avoid one while still changing the strategic balance. This is where analysts often use the term gray zone strategy. Gray zone actions fall between peace and open conflict. They are designed to apply pressure without crossing the threshold that would normally trigger a military response, a naval air exercise, a Coast Guard patrol, a cyber operation, trade restrictions, diplomatic pressure. Each action is significant enough to send a message, but usually not significant enough to justify a war. And that is what makes the strategy effective. Consider military exercises around Taiwan. Over the past several years, they have become larger, more frequent, and more complex. Some simulate maritime blockades, others involve coordinated air and naval operations, missile units, or long range strike capabilities. They begin, they end, ships return to port, aircraft fly home, but their impact is not limited to the few days they appear in the headlines. The same pattern can be seen at sea. China's Coast Guard has played an increasingly visible role in disputed waters. Unlike a navy, a Coast Guard operates under the language of law enforcement rather than warfare. That allows it to challenge vessels, enforce maritime regulations, and maintain a presence in contested areas without creating the same political consequences as deploying a warship. Pressure is applied, but the threshold of open conflict is avoided, and the strategy extends beyond ships and aircraft. Cyber operations can disrupt communications. Economic measures can target specific industries. Disinformation campaigns can shape public debate. Diplomatic pressure can isolate an opponent internationally. Individually, each tool has limits. Together, they create continuous pressure, not enough to start a war, but enough to make political decisions more difficult. That is the real logic of gray zone competition. Every government has a different threshold for responding to pressure. If it reacts too aggressively, it risks escalating the crisis. If it reacts too cautiously, it risks encouraging more pressure in the future. Gray zone strategy forces governments into that uncomfortable position again and again. And that is why it has become such a powerful tool in modern geopolitics. It does not rely on one decisive victory, it relies on hundreds of smaller actions. Each one appears temporary, each one seems manageable, but together they gradually reshape the strategic environment, which leads to an even more important question. If military power is not always being used to fight a war, what else is it being used for? The most valuable weapon isn't always military power. For most of history, power was measured by things you could count: the size of an army, the number of warships, the range of a missile. Those things still matter. But in the 21st century, another form of power has become just as important: information. Because every government faces the same problem. No leader ever makes decisions with complete certainty. Every major decision is based on imperfect information. What is your opponent actually willing to do? Where is their red line? How quickly can they react? How united are their allies? Those are some of the hardest questions in international politics, and they rarely have simple answers. That's why modern competition is often less about forcing an opponent into a mistake and more about understanding them before that mistake ever happens. Imagine assembling a thousand-piece puzzle with only a handful of pieces. At first, almost nothing makes sense, but every new piece reveals a little more of the picture. Eventually, patterns begin to emerge. International politics works much the same way. No single diplomatic crisis tells the whole story. No single military exercise reveals every capability. No single political statement explains how a country will behave in the future. But taken together over months or even years, those moments begin to reveal consistent patterns. Governments learn how quickly decisions are made, how leaders react under pressure, which actions trigger a response, and which are quietly ignored. That knowledge doesn't make the future predictable, but it makes it less uncertain. And in geopolitics, reducing uncertainty is a strategic advantage in itself. In military planning, surprise is one of the most valuable advantages. The fewer surprises a country faces during a crisis, the more options it has. That's why information is no longer simply something that supports military power. In many situations, it is military power. Because before countries shape events, they first try to understand them. When the extraordinary becomes ordinary, we often imagine history changing overnight: a declaration of war, a surprise attack, a single headline that divides the world into before and after. But history rarely works that way. Most of the time, change happens gradually, one decision at a time, one crisis at a time, one new reality replacing the old one until people barely notice the difference. This kind of gradual pressure isn't meant simply to influence today's events, it's meant to shape tomorrow's expectations. Think about military exercises around Taiwan. The first time dozens of aircraft crossed the median line of the Taiwan Strait, it made headlines around the world. It was treated as a major escalation. Today, similar operations receive far less attention, not necessarily because the situation has become safer, but because people have become more familiar with it. The extraordinary becomes expected. The exceptional becomes routine. That doesn't mean the risk disappears. If anything, it can become more difficult to recognize. Because once a new pattern becomes normal, governments, financial markets, and even the public begin adjusting their expectations around it. What once seemed unacceptable slowly becomes part of everyday geopolitical reality. And that process extends far beyond Taiwan. Throughout history, major shifts in international politics have rarely happened overnight. The Cold War did not begin with a single declaration. It emerged gradually through competing alliances, military deployments, political crises, and changing assumptions. People living through those events rarely knew they were witnessing the beginning of a new era. Only years later did the pattern become obvious. The same may be true today. Whether China's strategy ultimately succeeds or fails remains uncertain. Taiwan continues to strengthen its defenses. The United States continues to expand cooperation with regional allies. Japan, Australia, and other countries are investing heavily in their own security. None of these deployments guarantee a particular outcome, and they certainly do not make conflict inevitable. But they do illustrate an important reality. Competition between major powers is no longer defined only by battles that are fought. Increasingly, it is shaped by pressure that is sustained, by changing expectations, by perceptions that are gradually changed, and by new patterns that become accepted before anyone realizes how much has changed. Perhaps that is the biggest lesson of all. The future of conflict may not begin with a dramatic invasion or a formal declaration of war. It may begin with hundreds of smaller events, each one appearing temporary, each one seeming manageable, until together they reshape the strategic landscape. So perhaps the real question isn't whether China is preparing for war. Perhaps it's whether our understanding of war has already begun to change. Because if the world is still waiting for the start of a conflict, how would we know if it has already begun in another form?